Hello, I'm Jan Śrewiński. Welcome on board the Eastern Express, and as always, I hope you enjoy the journey. Now in this episode, we're talking about a situation so tense you could cut it with a butter knife, and a dull one at that. Russia's military, under orders from Vladimir Putin, is rehearsing the use of tactical nuclear weapons. Yes, just when you thought the evening news couldn't get any spicier, we're now discussing nukes as casually as a weather forecast. Why, you might ask? Well, Putin is ringing the alarm bells in response to what he perceives as threats from French President Emmanuel Macron. It appears that Macron's stance on Ukraine has rubbed Putin the wrong way, so much so that Russia is ready to play a game of who can scare whom more with nuclear drills. You know, things are serious when your response to a diplomatic scuffle is to wave around the nuclear playbook. So, without further ado, let's take a look at our latest report to find out more.
French President Emmanuel Macron's evolving stance on European security and his relationship with Russia have marked a significant shift in his foreign policy. Initially hopeful for a new security architecture that would integrate Russia more closely with Europe. However, he has had to adjust his approach dramatically due to the realities of war. The full-scale invasion in February 2022 validated the concerns of countries like Poland and the Baltic states, which had long warned against trusting Russian intentions. By December 2022, Macron's public acknowledgement of these realities began to reflect a changed perspective. His rhetoric shifted towards acknowledging that the security and integration of Europe must prioritize the needs and concerns of these nations over any rapprochement with Moscow.
Ukraine can count on France, its European partners and its allies to win the war. Russia cannot and must not win. As long as it attacks, it will be necessary for us to continue to adapt, to modulate the military support necessary to preserve Ukraine's future.
The urgency of this shift became even more pronounced in early 2024. In Stockholm, Macron starkly declared the necessity of supporting Ukraine at all costs to ensure it can negotiate peace from a position of strength. This stance was further solidified in Paris during the signing of a bilateral agreement with Ukraine in February 2024, where he highlighted the need for a collective awakening to address these threats effectively.
The security of all of us is now at stake. Ukraine is determined and needs us. We are undoubtedly at the moment of a necessary spring into action, given the transformation of the threat from a military and strategic point of view.
This evolving strategy reflects Emmanuel Macron's realization that the stability and security of Europe are inexorably linked to the resolution of the war in Ukraine.
And now it's time for a more detailed look at the issue at hand. Now, Emmanuel Macron hasn't exactly been whispering sweet nothings into Putin's ear. Last week, he hinted at the possibility of sending Western troops to Ukraine, adding a little extra fuel to the already blazing fire. He warns that Russia's actions are a significant threat to European security. In other words, Macron is not just sitting back with popcorn watching this unfold. He's considering pulling up a chair right into the ring. Meanwhile, the Kremlin isn't unhappy just with France. Oh no, it's a full international reception there. The US Senate recently passed a $61 billion aid package for Ukraine, and across the pond, the UK's top diplomat, none other than Lord David Cameron, mentioned that Ukraine might use British-supplied weapons against targets inside Russia. This prompted Dmitry Peskov, Putin's spokesman, to say that NATO soldiers facing Russian military is a new level of tension. He's not wrong, but it might be an understatement there. Putin's response? Well, a nuclear dress rehearsal, nothing else. These aren't your average weapons either, they are tactical nukes intended for battlefield use. We're talking about short-range missiles, artillery shells, perhaps even torpedoes that can carry a nuclear punch, intended to ensure Russia's territorial integrity and sovereignty. Essentially, it's like bringing a bazooka to a knife fight. The Pentagon's reaction was more of an eye roll than panic. Major General Pat Ryder calmly noted that there has been no change in Russia's strategic force posture, describing Russia's announcement as typical irresponsible rhetoric. It seems the US is treating this as another episode of Russia's long-running drama series, Cry Wolf. This nuclear saber-rattling coincides with Macron's meeting with China's Xi Jinping in Paris. European leaders have pinned some hope on Xi Jinping to encourage restraint on the part of Russia. After all, someone needs to turn down the heat before the kitchen gets too hot. William Albuquerque, former NATO official, thinks this is a blatant attempt at nuclear coercion aimed squarely at Macron. It's like telling your neighbor to turn down the loud music by knocking on the door with a sledgehammer. Subtle, it is not. And yet, as alarming as this sounds, the likelihood of actual nuclear use remains low. These exercises are more about posturing, about showing strength, both to the international community and to the Russian people themselves. After all, the purpose of a bluff is to make others fall, not to have to follow through. So as we wrap up, let's remember, the world of international politics is often about who blinks first. Let's hope everyone keeps their eyes wide open. And now, here to shed some more light on the issue at hand is our guest today, Paul Thompson, Vice Chairman of the British Conservatives in Paris. Hello and welcome to TVP World.
Hello, thank you for the invitation.
So Russia has been making some blatant nuclear threats recently. Do you think this is likely to have any effect on Macron and his decision-making process?
I don't think it will have much effect because I would expect that those threats would not be taken too seriously, in the sense that they would not be considered something that Russia would really follow through on. And therefore, I doubt it would have effect on French policy.
So looking at French policy, France has always had a complicated relationship with Russia, but there are analyses which suggest that this relationship is changing. How profound do you think this shift towards a more assertive stance actually is in both Emmanuel Macron himself, but also possibly in the entire French political establishment?
That is a very good question, but rather difficult to answer, but I will do my best. I think that there is probably a tactical dimension to it, and a dimension that is tied to specific current events, but not, and therefore does not necessarily represent a long-term shift. I say that because Macron has two reasons for changing from his initial position, which was that it had to be understanding of Russia, not humiliate Russia, and so on, as he said at the beginning of the war. One is that in the meantime, French influence in Africa has suffered considerably at the hands of Russia. Let me say that's a completely different issue, but in fact, I think it probably has some impact. Russia has succeeded in displacing France in 3 African countries, Burkina Faso, Mali, and Niger. And that is something which I'm sure Emmanuel Macron feels humiliated by and very unhappy about. Then the second consideration is that France has come to the realization, I believe, that their initial posture just didn't go down well with countries like Poland, like the Baltic countries, and that France was in fact in danger of jeopardizing its own leadership ambitions in Europe because of that position, and that therefore it behooved it to shift its position in order to have a better audience with countries, especially in Eastern Europe and in the Baltic countries that are most exposed to a Russian threat. In fact, most directly exposed.
So would you say that in terms of France's general ambitions to create the sort of European security architecture that could perhaps be complementary to NATO, the shift of the French stance towards Russia is actually a pivotal change here? Because it used to be the case that a succession of French presidents would think that this architecture would have to be built by taking into account Russia's so-called security interests. But now, as you've mentioned, it seems like Emmanuel Macron is actually taking into account the security interests of Central and Eastern Europe and instead starting to view Russia as an adversary. Do you think that it is perhaps because of this that this could be a lasting change, because it will encompass a set of stimuli, if you will, which would be essential for France to realize its dream of creating this sort of next level of security architecture within the European project, within the EU, also with NATO participating and so on?
That is another very good question, very important. I'm inclined to think that the ultimate bottom line, in other words, thinking well into the future, that the French position would be that there needs to be a security architecture which includes Russia, because Russia is there whether one likes it or not. It's not going to disappear into the Pacific Ocean. And therefore, even if one is very distrustful of Russia, nevertheless, having some sort of modus vivendi at the end of the day would be just considered a necessity in order to have a stable situation. But at the same time, it could very well be the case that there be a European security autonomy, strategic autonomy, as Emmanuel Macron is always saying, that would not include Russia. Russia would be sort of on the side, and the countries working actively by pooling acquisition of defense equipment and military planning and so on. That group of countries would not involve Russia. It would involve France. It would involve Poland as one of the very major actors. Germany, also the United Kingdom. I think that is what France would. That would be sort of the dream of France, to actually achieve that kind of distinctive European security identity that would not include Russia. But eventually, French thinking would say we can't just ignore Russia, and coming to some kind of, as I said, modus vivendi with Russia is desirable when it becomes possible.
So one analyst,
they don't put that in the forefront today, but I think that's probably in the back of their minds.
So one analyst actually said that even if France wants to achieve this objective, it will now negotiate from a position of what he referred to as balance of power. So no longer will France assume that Russia can be trusted to operate in good faith, to become a part of this architecture willingly. Instead, it is more about showing that the European Union is resilient, Europe in general is ready to defend its interests. So if Russia accepts that, perhaps at some point in the future, it could be included, or at least, as you mentioned, not ignored, because it is always going to be there in one form or another. Would you say that this really is the case, and that France is actually returning to its proper place? After all, it is a nuclear superpower, so it actually has parity in negotiating with Russia by saying simply, look, we've got nukes too. We've also got our strategy of deploying them in extreme circumstances, so we cannot be just bullied into submission.
I don't think, I would not say that France is a nuclear superpower. I would say Russia and the United States are really the two nuclear superpowers in terms of the quantity of nuclear arms that they possess, which are much higher than France. But you're right. France is a significant nuclear player, and it's not integrated into NATO. It's independent in its decision making, and I think Russia takes that on board, takes that seriously. So yes, that's a significant factor.
So now, looking into the future, do you think that this change of stance on the part of Emmanuel Macron is also likely to resonate with the public opinion? There were indications that most people in France are willing to support Ukraine. The question is, to what extent? To what degree? How far would they be prepared to go? And also, what will the opposition do? I mean, some parties well known for their sympathies towards the Kremlin. Does this also begin to change today, especially when it comes to the likes of Marine Le Pen, for example?
Well, the Rassemblement National, the party of Marine Le Pen, immediately was very critical of the Russian. Well, it condemned the Russian invasion of Ukraine in no uncertain terms, and it has stayed with that position to this day, and I don't think that will change. The question of to what extent France would support greater involvement, I think requires one to look at different levels. In terms of public opinion, I would imagine that hardly anyone in France would support sending French troops to Ukraine, something which Macron has envisaged, or at least referred to as a theoretical possibility on several occasions. My guess is public support for that would be just about zero in France. And among other political parties, I think there is. He was criticized by most of the other political parties, including Les Républicains, which is a center-right party, for referring to the possibility of sending French troops to Ukraine. Macron, you have to bear in mind that Macron, although a very intelligent person, also has a sort of irresistible urge to engage in theater, grand statements to try to sort of impress people, attract people's attention, and so on. And he's always, or he frequently, comes forth with these sort of bold performances that are not always well thought through, and they need to be taken with a grain of salt, I think, because sometimes he will just shift ground 2 weeks later on some very major issue. But at a basic level, yes, there is broad support in France for supporting Ukraine in this war, but it's not unlimited, and sending troops on the ground, I think, would be rejected by most political parties and French public opinion.
So a sobering assessment
take on things.
A sobering assessment there, but still strategic ambiguity is at least a step in the right direction. Paul Thompson was our guest today here on TVP World. Thank you very much for joining us and for sharing your expertise.
Thank you for the invitation. Always a pleasure.
And now it's time for Eastern News Flash, a curated selection of all the other stories from the East that you really don't want to miss. The European Union has not reached a consensus among its 27 member states on whether to stop recognizing Vladimir Putin as the president of Russia. According to a statement from EU spokesperson Petr Stanu, the power to recognize or not recognize the authority of a leader traditionally rests with individual member states, not the EU collectively.
This discussion emerged following Putin's inauguration, which the Ukrainian Ministry of Defense criticized as an attempt to legitimize his prolonged hold on power. The recent presidential election in Russia saw Putin secure a fifth term in a process that has been met with skepticism and criticism, both internally and internationally. The EU has previously taken unified stances against leaders it deems illegitimate, as seen with Syria's Bashar al-Assad and Belarus's Alexander Lukashenko, but only when all member countries unanimously agree. The spokesperson highlighted that there is currently no EU-wide agreement regarding Putin's legitimacy, despite the EU's critique of the Russian elections. Petr Stano reassured that the EU's position on the legitimacy of Russia's elections does not influence its steadfast support for Ukraine amidst ongoing conflicts.
Armenia has declared that it will not participate in funding the Collective Security Treaty Organization for the upcoming year. This decision, confirmed by a spokesperson from the Armenian Foreign Ministry, highlights a further step back from the Russian-led military alliance.
The move to halt funding is part of a broader shift by the Armenian government under Prime Minister Nikol Pashinyan, who has been steering the country towards closer relations with Western nations since his rise to power in 2018. Armenia has increasingly sought to establish security ties beyond its traditional alliance with Russia, reaching out to countries like France, the US, and India. The tension between Armenia and Russia escalated recently, particularly over the CSTO's inaction during Azerbaijan's military activities in Nagorno-Karabakh in September 2023. Despite the CSTO's commitment, akin to NATO's Article 5, to aid any member state facing aggression, the alliance did not intervene to support Armenia during the conflict, leading to severe criticism from Yerevan. Armenia's ongoing re-evaluation of its foreign policy and security arrangements emphasizes a pivot towards the West and a reassessment of its ties with traditional allies.
Hungarian Foreign Minister Peter Szijjártó announced that Hungary will not participate in NATO's proposed long-term support plan for Ukraine, labeling the initiative as a crazy mission. Szijjártó's remarks underscore Hungary's continued resistance to collective Western efforts to support Ukraine amidst its ongoing war against Russia.
The plan, which was put forward by NATO Secretary-General Jens Stoltenberg in late April, involves creating a $100 billion fund over 5 years to enhance Ukraine's defense capabilities. This would be achieved by increasing weapons supplies and possibly taking over some operational duties currently managed by the US-led Ukraine Contact Defense Group. Budapest is a staunch Russian ally in Central Europe, which entails, though is not limited to, opposition to sanctions on Russia and reluctance to engage in the Western alliance's aid initiatives. The refusal comes at a critical time as Ukraine experiences intensified military challenges, including successful Russian aerial attacks and delays in receiving Western aid. Additionally, the European Union has not met its own commitment to supply Ukraine with 1 million rounds of artillery shells by March, further complicating the support efforts.
Russia's aircraft manufacturer Yakovlev, a subsidiary of the state-owned defense conglomerate Rostec, has successfully circumvented international sanctions to procure approximately $500 million worth of components for military aviation equipment since 2022. This includes essential parts for radar systems and other hardware used in military aircraft.
The Moscow Times detailed that Yakovlev's acquisitions were specifically geared towards enhancing their production of Su-30 fighter jets and Yak-130 combat trainers. Notably, in September 2023, Yakovlev was involved in sending Yak-130 aircraft to Iran, further complicating the international response to Russia's evasion of sanctions. The activities of Yakovlev represents a broader trend among Russian defense manufacturers to bypass international sanctions imposed due to the ongoing geopolitical tensions. Other Russian companies were also engaged in similar practices between 2021 and 2023. In response to these violations, the European Union has tightened its legal framework against circumventing sanctions. The EU Council recently approved legislation that sets minimum penalties for such infringements, treating actions that evade sanctions as criminal offences across all member states.
And for this episode of Eastern Express, it's the end of the line. Please stay with us here on TVP World for more latest news and updates.